The room was cold. The silence between the two was thick, as if time had frozen the moment she walked through the door. Thomas Whitford didn't move. The old businessman looked at the young woman in front of him, a black woman with a serene face and an attentive gaze, not quite knowing what to expect from her. She was nervous. He could feel it. But he had control. He always had. "You can sit down, Miss Carter," Thomas said, his voice deep and slow, as if made of old wood, creaking with the weight of years. He gestured to the chair before him, a smile on his face, an apparently friendly gesture, but with something beneath the surface, something she couldn't see, but that he felt like thick smoke hanging in the air. Isabella Carter hesitated. She was there for one reason only, a job. The last opportunity after months of searching. The Whitford and Sons office, an empire in the financial market, wasn't a place to waste. She knew that. She also knew that the position of secretary wasn't just any salary. It was a chance to change her life. But something about this man, something in his gaze, made her feel an inexplicable discomfort. She sat down. Thomas watched her for a long moment, as if evaluating more than her competence for the job. He saw something in her, something he had seen before in others. It was a look, a presence. It was what fascinated him. He didn't have control over it, or perhaps he did, but he liked to think that nature always spoke louder. "You have good references, Miss Carter," he continued, his tone calm, almost as if he were measuring each word. "And what attracted me most was your dedication. That's something rare these days, don't you think?" Isabella smiled, a nervous smile. "Thank you, Mr. Whitford. I always give my best in what I do." She felt the weight of his words, and her heart beat a little faster. But she tried to maintain composure. She wasn't the type of person to show weakness. And maybe that was what had brought her here, to a place where it seemed everything moved around her with a calm that could only be forced. Thomas leaned forward, as if he wanted to whisper something important, but his expression never changed. The smile remained, but there was something insidious in his eyes, something Isabella couldn't define. "I'm a man who understands games," he said, and the way he pronounced games seemed off, as if that was the only verb he knew. "I hope you understand the importance of playing well here, in my world. What matters isn't just skills, Miss Carter. It's control, loyalty." His voice grew deeper, lower, and Isabella found herself involuntarily tense. She tried to look away, but his eyes followed her with an unsettling intensity. What did he want from her? What was he really saying? "You're going to need to be more than just a secretary here, my dear. You'll need to be someone I can trust completely. Do you understand that?" Isabella was at a loss for words. How could she answer? How could she explain that she didn't quite understand what was happening, or what he wanted from her? She only knew that the air felt heavier, denser, as if she was stepping into a game she didn't want to be a part of, but at the same time didn't know how to escape. The conversation dragged on for a few more minutes, with him talking about expectations, commitment, and other terms that sounded familiar, but at the same time were distorted in his voice, as if they took on a different meaning there. In the end, she stood up and left, feeling the weight of Thomas Whitford's words on her back. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, feeling uncomfortable, as if something was lurking, something she couldn't identify, but that she felt growing stronger. Thomas, on the other hand, stayed in his huge house, his distorted reflection in the glass of his office window. He knew the game was starting now. He knew there was something in Isabella that would make her perfect for what he wanted. Something in her he could mold, control, consume. The old businessman slowly stood up and walked to the bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself a glass of whiskey. His mind wandered to his darker thoughts. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel fear. He just wanted more. And Isabella, with her innocence and purity, was the perfect prize. "Now, the fun begins," he murmured to himself, a satisfied smile on his face. Thomas Whitford's obsession had only just begun. But Isabella didn't yet know how deep the hole could be. In the following days, Isabella found herself immersed in a cycle of intense and somewhat uncomfortable work. Every step, Every move seemed to be watched by Thomas Whitford, but in a way she couldn't define. He always seemed to be around, always ready to praise her, to make comments about her appearance or actions, disguised as professional advice, but with the hint of something more, something strange, something invasive. She didn't know what was happening, but the feeling of being controlled intensified every day. She was spared from heavier tasks, as if her job was merely to be a pleasant presence in the office. And while, on one hand, this was a relief, on the other, it made her feel useless, like a disposable piece in a large game. She still didn't understand. Thomas seemed more and more interested in her, and his interest, however subtle, did not go unnoticed. That afternoon, he called Isabella to his office again. He was closer now, friendlier, more approachable. The chair in front of him was empty, waiting for her presence, and his smile was genuine, or at least she wanted to believe it was. "Miss Carter, you've been doing an excellent job," he said, moving closer to her, his voice softer, as if he had a slight satisfaction in speaking. "I was thinking, it would be good if you felt a little more comfortable here. After all, you're in a position of trust now." Isabella smiled, trying to hide her discomfort. She knew the praise was just a way to maintain control over her, but at the same time, she couldn't deny that she liked being recognized, being seen. Thomas's trust, even though it made her uneasy, also made her feel special. I appreciate it, Mr. Whitford, but I'm just trying to do my best," she replied, nervously looking away. He watched her for a moment, the silence between them stretching, like a rope about to snap. "I know, my dear, you're dedicated, but, look, maybe you need something more to really feel at ease, something to unlock your potential, a little rest. Work can be stressful, can't it?" Isabella frowned. He was starting to sound more like a therapist than a boss. Something was wrong here, she knew. His need for control seemed greater every day, but she didn't know how to explain that to herself without seeming paranoid. Thomas picked up a bottle of wine from the table, and without waiting for a response, he began to pour it into a glass. The room was fragrant with the strong scent of the wine, and the sense that something was being prepared, something she couldn't avoid, made Isabella's stomach turn. She tried to ignore the warning in her head and accepted the glass. "It'll do you good, don't worry, I know what you need." The wine was smooth, sweet even, and Isabella felt herself relax slowly. Her mind, which had been so tense, began to calm, the discomfort fading. However, a part of her couldn't forget the insidious look Thomas had given her as she took the sip. Guilt began to rise to the surface, but she quickly pushed it away. He was being kind. He was just taking care of her, right? But the days passed, and the feeling of exhaustion never disappeared. In fact, it got worse. Isabella felt increasingly drained, her nights of sleep interrupted by strange nightmares. She couldn't understand. Every morning, she woke up with a sense of emptiness, as if the last night had been blurred, erased by something she didn't comprehend. She was beginning to forget little things, details that seemed to dissipate from her mind as the day went on. All she knew was that something was terribly wrong with the way Thomas was treating her. She began to notice that his compliments weren't just about her work, but about her appearance, the way he looked at her, as if he was always waiting for something she couldn't give. The wine, the drink he offered every time she seemed more nervous, more uncomfortable. The sweet words that came from his mouth, the feeling that she was being slowly stripped of her control, of her identity. And then, one morning, something changed. Something that made her realize, in a horrible way, what was really happening. She entered Thomas's office, and as she took a step, her foot slipped. She almost fell but managed to steady herself on the table. "Are you okay, Miss Carter?" Thomas asked, rising with an unusual speed. He seemed concerned, but not in a genuine way, and she could see in his eyes a subtle glimmer, something she had never noticed before. He knew. She, on the other hand, knew too. Something was happening to her, and she didn't know what to do. Thomas was indeed manipulating her, controlling her, and she was starting to see the pieces of the puzzle fitting together. The nights, the drinks, the inexplicable fatigue. the things she couldn't remember. She wasn't imagining it. It was all really happening. At that moment, reality hit hard. She needed to get out of there. She needed to find a way to break free from the web he had woven. But would it be too late? That night, Isabella barely slept. Her thoughts were racing, and the feeling of being watched, surveilled, seemed stronger than ever. Reality had begun to impose itself in an alarming and undeniable way. She could no longer ignore the signs, the wine, the veiled compliments. Thomas's subtle but constant control over her life. Everything she had thought were mere coincidences was now unfolding before her with the clarity of a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The next morning, she walked into the office with an overwhelming sense of urgency. Her body was exhausted, her eyes heavy, and a strange fog hung over her mind. She felt like she was floating, detached from her own body. She was losing control, and there was no turning back. Thomas watched her enter with a smile, the kind she now recognized as fake. His sympathetic expression masked something much deeper, something unsettling. He knew, she knew. "Good morning, Miss Carter. How are you today?" His voice, soft and syrupy, made Isabella's stomach turn. She didn't respond immediately. The words stuck in her throat. Her eyes were fixed on him, but her mind was elsewhere. She felt the urge to leave, to flee to anywhere, but something held her back. As if an invisible force kept her there, in that office, in that room, in that prison. "Is everything okay?" Thomas insisted, stepping toward her in a way that made her take a step back. "No, everything is not okay." Her voice was hoarse, as if simply speaking took all her strength. Isabella stared at Thomas, trying to hide the fear forming in her chest. I know what you've been doing." Thomas's smile vanished. He didn't try to hide the change in expression. His eyes turned colder, more calculating. The controlled businessman, so poised until that moment, now seemed to reveal a bit of his true face. A face Isabella was beginning to understand. I know what you've been doing to me." Her words now rang louder, like a declaration of war. She was battling the fog that consumed her mind, but the clarity, as painful as it was, freed her in a way she hadn't expected. You've been drugging me." Thomas took a step back, as if struck by an invisible blow, but soon his face recovered, like a mask had been put back on. He smiled, but it wasn't with the same shine, the same confidence. There was something unstable about his behavior now. "You're becoming paranoid, my dear. This is all in your mind," he tried to say. But the insecurity in his voice was evident, something he couldn't hide. He knew she was beginning to understand, and that put her dangerously close to discovering the truth. But Isabella wasn't willing to let this pass anymore. The fog in her mind started to dissipate, and the pieces of the puzzle finally fit. She wasn't crazy, and she wouldn't let him make her believe she was. He had manipulated her for so long that she no longer knew what was real and what was manipulation. But now, she knew the power was in her hands. "You can't deceive me anymore, Thomas. I know everything. I know about the wine, the nights I don't remember, what you've been doing. Don't think you can control my mind like you did with so many others before me." He stared at her for a long moment, and the room fell silent. The heavy, threatening silence was deafening. "You're smarter than I thought, Miss Carter, but you still don't understand what's really going on here." Thomas's tone was now dark, and the tension in the air was palpable. That moment was crucial. Isabella knew she couldn't back down. The path to freedom lay here, and she had no more time to lose. The control he had over her, which she thought she was losing, was actually taking on a different form. She wouldn't be at peace in his game anymore. She took a deep breath, her mind cleared by rage and courage. "I'm going to end this, Thomas, and you won't be able to stop me." Those words were like a sentence. Something that had seemed fragile and impossible to say before, now became an irresistible force. The man who once seemed untouchable was now becoming vulnerable, and she felt it in every fiber of her being. Thomas smiled, but it was an empty smile, without strength. He knew he couldn't control her anymore. The game was ending, and he was losing. He had lost control of his own game. Isabella didn't know what to do with the rage pulsating inside her. Ever since confronting Thomas in the office, a mixture of euphoria and fear consumed her, as if all the energy from what was happening was about to explode. She had finally been able to see beyond the curtains he had drawn over her eyes. But the truth came with a price. The freedom she wanted felt like a prison, an unbearable weight. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. Not Thomas, of course, but not even the people who claimed to be her friends, nor the security that the job represented. Isabella began to realize that, if she truly wanted to break free from the web of control she was trapped in, she would need to do more than just confront him. She needed to get out of that place. Out of this dirty power game. But the cost would be higher than she could imagine. When she returned home that night, the walls of her house felt more closed in than ever. The silence surrounding her was oppressive, and every step she took in the kitchen, in the hallway, seemed to carry the weight of a decision that would change her life forever. She collapsed on the couch, her body heavy, as if she were carrying the world. The fatigue, now more evident, was something different. It wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, a deep weariness that was starting to affect every cell of her being. The sedation Thomas had subjected her to was no longer just about physical control. It was something that reached the core of her soul. Each dose seemed to have shaped a part of her, leaving her more vulnerable, more submissive. But Isabella's greatest fear wasn't the manipulation itself. It was what she would have to do to escape. How would she deal with the idea of living outside Thomas's control, finally being the master of her own decisions? The uncertainty was suffocating. As much as she knew what she had to do, there was something more, something that kept her mind spinning, a detail, a small piece of the puzzle that consumed her. Over the last week, Isabella had started hearing strange conversations in the office hallway, low whispers, furtive glances between colleagues. She didn't know what was happening, but her intuition told her there was something much darker behind it all. Then, one night, as the city lights shone outside, she made a choice. After years of living in Thomas's shadow, manipulated and controlled, it was finally time to act. Isabella got out of bed, grabbed her phone, and dialed the number. She knew she would never have the courage to call again. She had a plan that involved more than just leaving her prison. She wanted to destroy it. "I need help," she said softly, almost a whisper, but her determination was clear. "I know what he did. I know what he is. And I'm going to end it." On the other end of the line, the lawyer's voice was serious, but filled with understanding. He knew what she wanted. He knew how much she was willing to lose for justice. "Do you have proof, Isabella? We can't wait any longer, or he'll make you disappear." Isabella took a deep breath. Knowing there was no turning back, she had been a piece in Thomas's game, but now she was ready to flip the board. With the lawyer's support, she knew she could finally put an end to it all, but there was still danger. What would Thomas do when he found out she was about to expose him? In the following weeks, as the case took shape, Isabella felt as if she were walking on a tightrope. Every step she took brought her closer to the truth, but also left her more vulnerable. She knew that once the lawsuit was filed, Thomas wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. He would try to destroy her reputation, her life. He had power, and all she had was her will to be free. Isabella became a shadow of herself, walking the streets at night, afraid to be seen. The psychological pressure was unbearable, and every corner she turned, she felt Thomas's presence, watching, manipulating from afar. What she didn't know was that the battle she was about to fight wouldn't be just about justice. The real fight would be against the system that allowed people like Thomas to wield so much power, manipulating and controlling lives in their selfish journey. The office seemed like a different place now. The smell of coffee, once so comforting, now tasted bitter in the back of her throat. Isabella felt eyes on her with every move. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she knew everything she had done had led her to this point. She was no longer the fragile, manipulated woman, but an unstoppable force, ready to face the ghosts that had once haunted her. The decision to file the lawsuit against Thomas had already been made. There was no going back. But what she didn't know was that the old businessman, so imposing and controlling, was only one step away from discovering that his prison was about to be destroyed. He watched her, as he always had, but this time with a hint of arrogance in his eyes. Thomas believed everything was still under his control. But Isabella knew deep down that his empire of lies was about to crumble. She had gathered the evidence, the documents showing the manipulations, the receipts for the sedative substances he used to drug her, the records of compromising conversations. Her lawyer had everything in hand, and the war was about to begin. But the hardest part of all this was the constant fear of being found, of being destroyed by someone who had the power to destroy anyone around him. And it was at this moment of uncertainty, while sitting in her office, surrounded by yet another mountain of papers and evidence, that the news came. Thomas wasn't intimidated. He never had been. He was a man of power, and lies, to him, were just tools to keep everything he wanted. But Isabella had become something different. She was no longer the puppet he manipulated. She was the hand that now cut the strings. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from the lawyer. She read it with a dazed mind. He's ready to confess. He's willing to make a deal. Isabella stopped. Her heart raced. What was this? Thomas wanted a deal. The pressure was mounting, and now he wanted to negotiate. She knew she was faced with a crucial choice. The truth was a minefield. Thomas's confession could be the end of her freedom or the beginning of a new cycle. But it wasn't just that. The revelation he was about to make wasn't just about the relationship she'd had with him. It was about the whole empire he had built, filled with secrets, people who had been affected in ways she never imagined. In the lawyer's office, Isabella felt the weight of the decision. Thomas's strategy seemed clear now. He was trying to manipulate the narrative before it was fully exposed. But she wouldn't be fooled. Not anymore. While the lawyer spoke to her, a light breeze entered through the window, almost